Hello, I am Victoria, author and editor. Today we're going to talk about querying in the modern publishing industry. If you want to take notes while watching this presentation, there's a button below the video where you can download handouts with the slides I'm going to be using. All right, let's jump right in. First of all, it's important if you're querying literary agents to understand exactly what the benefits of traditional publication are. If you're querying literary agents, you've probably decided that traditional publication is the route you want to take, and specifically traditional publication with a big publishing house. But I still like to run through the pros and cons. There are a lot of options today with publication. You can be a hybrid author, you can publish with a small press, but these pros and cons are centered on traditional publication with a big house versus self-publication. So one of the really big pros of traditional publication is agent and publisher support. You do not have to do everything by yourself. You have an agent helping you, supporting you, protecting you, and then you have a publisher who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to actually getting your book into the hands of readers. You also get a cash advance. So when a publisher decides to publish your book, you get some money. It may not be enough to, buy your dream house in Hawaii, but it's something. And with traditional publication, there are no upfront costs. So in addition to receiving money, you are not paying any out. And career opportunities. Because there are gatekeepers in the agents and the publishing houses, traditional publishing is inherently more prestigious. Cons. Traditional publishing takes a while. If you're querying literary agents, you likely already have a taste of that. You can spend years querying agents, and then another year polishing your book, and then 6 months to a year on submission, and that's before it ever even gets into the publisher's hands. Yes, independent publication still takes a while, but not nearly that long, and there are ways to expedite it. Another big con of traditional publication is the limited control. The publisher has the final say. You do not get the final word on things like cover design, edits. These final decisions are out of your hands. Also, there are no guarantees. You can put in a lot of work. You can get an agent, you can go on submission, and still not get a book deal. And lower royalty percentage. So you're sacrificing some of your royalties for the services that a publishing house is able to provide. So basically, when you're looking at traditional publication versus self-publication, traditional publication requires more time and energy upfront. Self-publication requires more money upfront. All right, the traditional publication process. Just very briefly, I'm going to run through it. Writers query literary agents with their manuscript. Agents request manuscripts that they like, and if they love them, then they offer representation. Agents then submit those manuscripts to publishing houses. And if the publishing house loves it, then the author gets a book deal. It sounds so nice and easy when you put it like that. But unfortunately, we all know it's a much more involved process. And that brings me to my next slide. Now, I'm not trying to bum you out with this. I really do have a point in showing you these numbers and reiterating this. These are statistics from the Nelson Literary Agency. These are their 2019 stats. As an agency, they received 14,000 query letters. They signed 14. So that is 1 out of every 1,000 query letters they received was successful. There are a few reasons that I am showing you this. First of all, I want to reiterate that querying is hard. It is not easy, it is difficult, and the numbers are not fantastic. So anybody who's telling you that they are getting 75% full requests on their query letters, they are probably lying. It's nothing to be ashamed of when your request rates are not super high. Think about all the things that have to go right for an agent to fall in love with your query and request your manuscript. Of course, there are things we can do to improve your chances, and we are going to talk about some of those, but I think writers should go in with the expectation that this is going to be a long road. The other thing that I really want to reiterate about these numbers is the numbers. 14,000 query letters. That is a lot. Can you imagine what that would even look like? 14,000 letters. This is not the way it always was. Agencies did not always receive 14,000 query letters per year. So when you're writing your query letter, you have to have that in mind, that number of queries that agents are receiving, and you have to be focused on hooking them immediately. That brings me to the next slide, the difference between old school and modern querying strategies. Old school querying strategies were designed for when you would write your query letter, you would put it in an envelope, you would take it to the post office, and you would send it off, and then you would wait patiently for the agent to return a response with either a fantastic, yes, send me some pages, or no, I'm not interested. But you could be fairly certain that either the agent or the agent's assistant, somebody probably read your query letter. That is no longer the case. It is so easy to send query letters. And I don't mean that in that querying is easy. I mean that it's just simple and fast. You can take your query letter, paste it into an email, and send it off to 20 agents in 5 minutes. So agents' inboxes are saturated. You are no longer guaranteed that a human being is going to sit down and read your query letter. That means that you can no longer write it like a traditional letter. Your query is a sales pitch. And a lot of the ways we used to structure queries do not work anymore because it involved putting some of the dry information at the top. And now you have 1 second to get that agent's attention. You have to make sure that first line is irresistible. It's really important to reframe the way that we think about query letters. As I said, it's not a letter, it is a sales pitch. You have to learn how to sell your manuscript. And to sell something, you have to identify the most interesting, most critical parts of it and highlight those. The anatomy of a query letter. Let's break this down into its parts, and we're going to talk about each a little more in depth. So the salutation and specs is Dear Agent, which would not actually be Dear Agent, it would be Dear, the agent's last name. And the specs are the word count and the genre and age category. The hook is 1 to 2 sentences placed directly after the salutation and before the mini synopsis. The mini synopsis is the bulk of your query letter, so it is kind of like the back cover blurb on a book. The bio is about the author, meant to lend credibility and show us why you are the best person to write this book. And the closing is just the polite thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. The mini synopsis. The mini synopsis should clarify some very important elements. The setting, depending on your genre, the setting may be more or less important. The protagonist, of course. Now note with the setting and protagonist, you are not giving backstory. We're beginning in medias res, just like we do in the first chapter. And then these next two are crucial. These are the two big things that must be clarified in your mini synopsis. The main conflict. So conflict is what happens when a character wants something and something else is in the way. So what is your protagonist's main goal and what is keeping them from achieving that goal? And the stakes. When I see a weak query letter, 9 times out of 10, the stakes are either not high or not specific. So the stakes are what happens if the protagonist fails to meet their goal. So on the subject of stakes, I'm going to give a quick example. At my last in-person querying event, a student actually put me on the spot and asked me a question, and I had to think through it very quickly. She asked me, if you were writing a query letter for Harry Potter, what would the stakes be? And that is a great example because the first thing that you think of is, well, the stakes are if Harry fails to defeat Voldemort, then Voldemort wins and takes over, and what? The world descends into evil and darkness and bad things happen. That is not specific enough for a query. For a query, your stakes need to be focused. If I were querying Harry Potter, I would emphasize the fact that Harry lost his family and has found this surrogate family in Ron and Hermione. And if he fails to defeat Voldemort, he could lose them. That is specific. We know exactly what is at stake for this character, what he could possibly lose. All right, so the next slide, just some more important mini synopsis elements. We already talked about most of this, except that last one, the lingering question. When you're setting up your mini synopsis, structures vary, but typically you want to begin in medias res with the inciting incident. So what happens that catalyzes the whole story? Then you're going to dive into the conflict, and then clarify the stakes. And then you end with that lingering question of whether the stakes will be realized, whether the character will have to meet those consequences of failing to achieve their goal. Some common issues with the mini synopsis. Mentioning extraneous characters. Try to only mention the characters that you absolutely have to for it to make sense. And my general rule of thumb is that if you don't mention the character more than once, don't use their name. Another big issue is beginning too early, trying to set the scene, set everything up, and make sure that the agent knows all about the backstory and the setting and all of this information before you get to that main conflict. But there is not time. This may have worked in the past, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. This may have been a better strategy, but currently it is not. You need to start with that inciting incident, get to that main conflict. In addition to beginning too early, a lot of mini synopses end too early. A lot of writers will set up that main conflict, but then they won't lay out the stakes. So we don't have that lingering question because we don't really have a reason to care. Okay, the character wants this. This is in the way, but nothing happens if they fail, or we don't know what happens if they fail. And when that's the case, the agent has no reason to want more. And that is your job as the querier, is to make the agent finish reading and say, I need more. That's when they request pages. And the final issue in mini synopses is writers giving a play-by-play. Even though it has the same name as the synopsis, which you include as supplemental materials, the mini synopsis is not a play-by-play of the plot. You'll notice that the plot was not one of those huge elements that I mentioned. The plot is not what we are focusing on here. It's too big. You are not summarizing your manuscript in the mini synopsis. You are focusing in on those elements that are going to make the agent want more. You're not trying to give the agent all the information about your manuscript in the query. It's not possible, and it will just dry it out. You're focusing in on those few things that will whet their appetite and prepare them for your manuscript. Alright, that's the mini synopsis. Let's talk about the hook. A lot of people omit the hook or do not give it the time and attention it deserves. In my opinion, the hook is the single most important part of your query. If the hook does not grab the agent's attention, then the rest of the query doesn't matter because they are not going to read it. You have to reel them in immediately. So the hook is 1 to 2 lines before the mini synopsis. So it's Dear Agent, straight into the hook, and then the mini synopsis. So the hook is its own paragraph. The hook should be unique. The hook is not a log line. Again, you are not summarizing with the hook. You are focusing in on an interesting part of your manuscript. So honestly, I could do a whole video on how to write hooks, because the important thing is for the hook to be unique. There's no pattern that you can really follow. The hook should be concise. It should be very, very tight. My general recommendation when it comes to hooks is to use the brainstorming approach. Write out the most interesting parts of your manuscript. Is it the voice? Do you blend unlikely genres? Is it your protagonist, your setting? If somebody were describing your manuscript, your book, to a friend, they walked up to the friend and they said, I just finished this book. I absolutely loved it. And the friend said, oh, why was it so good? What would that reader say? What details, what elements of your book would they pick out to brag on? That's what you want. So my suggestion is to write out those elements and then choose the 3 most interesting ones. Write a hook from each of those elements, and then try to incorporate the main conflict into each hook. And then take those hooks that you just wrote and play the telephone game with them. Change them a little bit. Just write, fill up page after page if you need to. Just keep changing those hooks a little bit, and see what you come up with. You really have to work to generate that creative energy with this. There's no shortcut to writing a hook, and in my honest opinion, the hook should take you as long to write as the rest of the query. Again, I want to stress how important I believe the hook is. I really think it is key. And this is one of those things that, again, in the modern publishing industry, because it is not a given that the agent is going to read your full query letter, it is absolutely crucial that you hook them right off the bat. All right, moving on to the bio. The bio has one job, and that is to answer the question, why are you the best person to write this book? You can answer that question by listing previous publications, relevant degrees, and relevant experience. So if you have experience in the subject matter of your book, maybe you lived where the book is set, maybe you have the same occupation as the protagonist, anything like that lends credibility to you as the author. As far as previous publications, here we are talking about traditionally published books and short story publications. Unless your self-published book sold exceptionally well, generally there's no need to include that. And again, if you have maybe scholarly publications that are related to your subject matter, you could include those as well. If you do not have anything relevant to include in the bio, omit it. Don't add fluff, and don't, add personal details or anything just for the sake of having a bio. It's better to just leave the bio out than to add irrelevant information. Comp titles. Comp titles are titles of books, or technically you can use other works as well, plays, movies, TV shows that are similar in nature to your manuscript. So comp titles have 2 main purposes. The first is to illustrate that you understand your target audience. By comparing your book to other works, you show that you understand your book's position in the current market. Because of this, it's typically better to use more modern works. If you can use books published within the last 5 years, that again just shows that you read in your genre, that you are aware of what other authors are doing and what readers are looking for. The second purpose of comp titles is to convey concepts that may be difficult to get across in the mini synopsis. I always recommend with comps that instead of just saying that my book is like this book, say specifically why. So maybe it has the lighthearted humor of this title. Be as specific as you can. That just gives the agent a lot more information without really taking up any page space in your query. Next is the specs. Those are the genre, word count, and age category. As I mentioned, traditionally the specs would be one of the first things you introduce. I find that they work well between the mini synopsis and the bio. Typically, I like to place the specs and the comps in one paragraph there. Some agents do still prefer to see the specs up top, so of course, follow the guidelines on the agent's website. As far as genre, include one genre. Resist the temptation to include 2 or 3 genres. Narrowing it down to one genre, again, it just illustrates that you understand what your book is and its place in the market, where it would be shelved in the bookstore. You could still say that it is, let's say, a romance novel with elements of magical realism. But try to keep the genre to a single identifier. Word count, rounded to the nearest 1,000, and make sure it is in the range for your genre. If you have a book that's 200,000 words, chances are an agent is not going to take a chance on that because they know a publisher will not take a chance on that. It's expensive and it generally shows that the book has not been edited sufficiently. All right, I'm going to share another opinion here that you will find contradicts conventional querying wisdom, and that is that personalizations are usually not necessary and not effective. In very few cases do I recommend putting the personalization up top. Typically only if you have received a direct request from that agent. So maybe you pitched them at a conference or in a Twitter contest and they said, send me your query letter. Then you would say up front, hey, you requested this. Other than that, there are really very few times that you would use the personalization at all, but especially putting it first thing. Another strong personalization is if your book fits something that the agent requested specifically in their manuscript wish list. And I don't mean the list that is posted on their agent's website. I mean using the hashtag, probably something very, very specific, like a steampunk retelling of Cinderella. If you are able to match up to that kind of request, then you can tell them up front. But as far as querying an agent and saying, I see that you represent this genre, my book is this genre, I hope you like it. It's just not necessary. The agent knows what they represent, and they assume that you have done that research and are sending them things that they represent, and they'll also be able to tell that pretty quickly from your query. So again, this is just filler that the agent has to slog through before they get to the good stuff. We're trying to get that important, attention-grabbing material to the agent as quickly as we can. So that's my 2 cents on personalizations. Moving on to strategies. So I have 2 big strategies when it comes to querying as far as actually structuring your querying process. The first is querying in rounds. This is a more traditional strategy, and it has some pros and cons, but I find that near the beginning of the querying process, it's a pretty good strategy to take, at least to loosely structure your process. Querying in rounds involves querying a set number of agents at a time, maybe 10, and then waiting for responses, and then querying 10 more. The big positives here are that you get to basically give your dream agents dibs. So you would query the agents who you are most interested in working with first. The other big plus to doing it this way is that you get to adjust. So maybe you get a personalized rejection. You can take that feedback and implement it before you send your query out to more agents. You can also just adjust based on the responses that you're receiving. If you're receiving nothing but form rejections, that gives you an idea that you might need to go back to the drawing board. The downsides here are that while you are giving your dream agents dibs, you are also potentially sending them the weakest version of your query, since you don't have an opportunity to adjust before they get it. And this can be slow, especially since for a lot of agents, no response means no. You may not know when an agent has actually passed on your query. And some agents just take a while. Agents can easily take 6 months to respond to a query as the norm. So following this process strictly can very much slow your overall querying. A strategy that I very much like, especially later in the process, is the 1 in, 1 out rule. This just means that when you receive a rejection, you immediately sit down and send another query. Ideally, you have a list of agents already researched and ready to roll, so you just send out your query as soon as you get that rejection letter. I like this because you constantly have queries out there, and it creates a positive response to that rejection. Querying involves a lot of rejection for most people. A select few may get that positive response early on, but most people query at least 100 agents, and likely multiple manuscripts. So it can get disheartening. And in my opinion, it's really good to attach that positive action to take control of your querying process. All right, so we have covered quite a bit of stuff in this. Of course, we are just scratching the surface. I can tell you this is about a third of the length of the presentation I use for in-person workshops. Of course, if you're interested in more comprehensive training, you can check out the query course at go.victoriagriffin.com/success. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I am more than happy to chat through email. Happy querying, and I'll see you next time.